Hello and welcome to the Australian-New Zealand Environmental History Network Conference for 2020. I'm Dr. Margaret Cook, and I acknowledge that I am sitting here on Yagara country in Ipswich in Queensland. And I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And I also acknowledge those on the lands of where you are joining us from. So our first speaker is Emily O'Gorman, and she's talking about wetlands. And her work is based on her forthcoming book with the University of Washington Press, which is called Wetlands in a Dry Land, and it's coming out in April 2021. So thanks, Emily. Over to you.
While I'm more used to writing and talking about archives grounded in particular watery places, I've come to appreciate that some of the critical sites in the history of wetlands are boardrooms and government buildings. The decisions and disagreements of bureaucrats and scientists in Australia and elsewhere about what has counted as a wetland and why have had long-lasting and mixed consequences. While we might think of the category of wetlands as natural and value neutral, it is not. It is historical and has been shaped by specific sets of values. In his study of Canada's west coast, Bruce Braun has argued that something called a forest, far from being self-evident and in a space outside of politics, enters history. Like forests, wetlands have been made visible. In the 1960s and 1970s, wetlands had a historical moment. They entered history as an international category and object of conservation. Two key factors shaped the emergence and category of wetlands in this period and are important in the history of wetlands more generally. Multiscalar politics and bird centrism. Each of these have had particular stakes, creating lasting tensions within wetlands conservation and management. National and global environmental movements, specific diplomacy and scientists mounting concerns over species and habitat loss converged to shape the Australian government's involvement in the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, particularly as waterfowl habitat, which is its full title, and simultaneously a Japan-Australia migratory bird agreement in the early 1970s. These two international agreements need to be understood as connected, as the Australian government sought to shore up the conservation of migratory birds and their watery habitat together, and at the same time enhance its influence over conservation matters within the states. Australian government conservation departments leveraged the agreements jointly to initiate a nationwide wetland survey. For this paper, I will focus on why this survey was initiated, why it was ultimately abandoned, and what the consequences of its abandonment have been. For some government scientists, Australia's involvement in the Ramsar Convention and a migratory bird treaty with Japan highlighted a paucity of knowledge about what now might be classified as wetlands on a national scale. Individual studies showed that there had been losses of important waterbird habitat in specific places, such as a 1970 study which indicated that 60% of wetlands along coastal New South Wales had been destroyed or degraded, largely due to drainage for flood mitigation. Yet any effort to quantify losses more widely was difficult, perhaps amplified by the fact that wetlands themselves were only just being made visible as objects of scientific study. So in 1972, members of the Australian Committee on Waterbirds, made up of state and federal government researchers and managers, proposed a national wetland survey focused on waterbird habitat in order to support Australia's obligations to both the Ramsar Convention and the Japan Agreement. The proposal for a survey of wetland habitats of Australian waterbirds, as it was called, was approved by the Australian government. But then a Council of Nature Conservation Ministers significantly widened the brief to go beyond an examination of waterbird habitat and encompass all wetland areas so as to be beneficial to a wider section of government agencies. Ultimately, 3 CSIRO research divisions became involved in undertaking essentially separate investigations as to whether such a survey was feasible. Wildlife, land use and fisheries and oceanography. Notably, the Australian government researchers did not use the Ramsar definition of wetlands, which encompassed a very wide range of watery places, including coral reefs, as they sought to reflect Australian ecologies and concerns within the international frameworks. The 3 divisions ultimately, but uneasily, decided on a definition that also suited their expertise and the goals of the survey. Wetlands include swamps, marshes, wet meadows, billabongs, lakes, estuaries and coastal lagoons, mangrove flats. These may be temporary or permanent. The main streams or main channels of rivers are excluded, except for the survey of fissures. Each of the feasibility studies soon ran into problems. The Division of Wildlife Research aimed to test methodologies for classifying wetlands according to the needs of water birds, assessing faunal diversity or richness, and assessing populations of water birds. It focused on 6 sites, all in New South Wales. While they had some success at these sites, this study threw into question the practicality of undertaking a continent-wide survey. The diversity of bird species and different and changing habitat needs made implementing a single methodology too difficult, and constraints of budget and people power meant that comprehensive data simply could not be gathered. The Division's report concluded that a national survey might not be the most important step to take next in water birds conservation. What was needed was rather detailed ecological research. Further, the chief of the division admitted that while ephemeral wetlands in Australia were important for their opportunistic use by water birds, no one has yet been able to properly assess them. At present, we have no idea how we will be able to overcome that problem when the survey begins. Dynamic wetlands in an arid continent proved a challenge for any simple process of quantification. The other divisions ran into similar problems. Further, the wetlands survey was being pulled into different directions by the different CSIRO divisions and towards essentially 3 different models of wetlands. Wetlands for birds, wetlands as hydrological entities, and wetlands as fisheries and estuaries. The 3 divisions, each seeing major issues with beginning a national wetlands survey, requested more funds and time for pilot studies, which would then inform a wetlands survey proper, with an estimated cost of $3.3 million over 8 years. No more funding was granted, and the wetlands survey was labelled not essential by the government, now a Conservative Liberal government. In 1979, the Acting Minister of Environment and Science stated that the wetlands survey was not implemented because of cost, lack of agreement on a national approach, and differences of opinion on the extent to which a national survey should concentrate on the aquatic fauna or the total wetlands ecosystem. The survey had ultimately become unworkable. That the survey did not or could not go ahead has had a range of implications. Perhaps most significantly, wetlands ecologists have limited ability to give robust estimates of the losses of wetlands. As recently noted by wetlands ecologists, an understanding of the distribution and extent of wetlands is critical for effective management and policy, but remains a knowledge barrier across Australia. Currently, information on wetlands is compiled from patchy state and territory summaries, with only 2 states undertaking reasonable monitoring, but using different methodologies. This means that there is no contemporary national map of wetlands distribution and extent. The only consistent national wetlands database remains a narrow data set from the 1960s that is plagued by a range of problems, including inconsistent attribution of types of wetlands and an inability to account for ephemeral wetlands. Instead, a case-by-case and typology approach to wetlands conservation has unfolded, focusing on important or iconic sites that have reasonable historical research behind them. Birds have remained central to wetlands conservation, management and sciences. For example, the health of these places in Eastern Australia is reviewed each year by wetlands ecologists through an aerial bird survey, which also monitors numbers of threatened and migratory birds. While birds are treated as indicators of the general condition of wetlands, the view of wetlands that these surveys produce are necessarily the view of birds and not those of other biota. Further, while biodiversity is given increasing emphasis in wetlands management, this at times amounts to diversity of different bird species. Libby Robin has argued that birds will continue to be important in environmental conservation and management in Australia, partly for historical reasons, as there has simply been so much research on them in the past that comparisons across time are better founded than for most other animals and plants. So to briefly conclude, wetlands entered history in this period as an international category of conservation, gathering specific sets of values and expertise shaped by multiscalar politics and bird centrism. This history has had significant and mixed consequences for the way wetlands are understood and managed within conservation science and governments today. This is a category that we need to keep revisiting and refining, asking what counts as a wetland for whom and with what consequences. Thank you.